Hello and welcome to the LLG Grapevine podcast. You're listening to Helen McGrath, Head of Public Affairs, and Dennis Hall, LLG Bulletin Editor.
Hello, everyone.
In a week where WhatsApp messages are dominating the headlines, let's hear what's going on in the world of local government. Dennis.
The public spending watchdog's finding that hasty implementation of reforms by the Courts and Tribunal Service is putting extra pressure on the courts was echoed by the Law Society last week. In its report, Progress on the Courts and Tribunals Reform Programme, the National Audit Office stated that despite an increased budget, the Court Service does not expect to be able to deliver the £1.3 billion programme to its current timetable and full scope. Law Society President Lubna Shuja said, "We support the government's investment in a reform programme to modernise and improve court services. However, those reforms must not come at the expense of justice. Our concern, reflected in the National Audit Office's report, is that delays in the courts are being exacerbated by ineffective reforms which are costing more time and wasting money." The reform programme itself was launched in 2016 and was due to be completed by December of this year. Shuja said, "We ask that the Court Service clarify what the updated timeline is to deliver the full programme and whether there will be funding for their projects to be sustained in the future." The implementation of the Common Platform computer system in particular comes under criticism in the report. Shuja says, "New technology should only be fully implemented once it has been robustly tested, evaluated, and proven to work. Otherwise, as we have heard from members, it will only cause further setbacks in the system." Shuja also highlighted in the Audit Office's report the finding that the Court Service lacks data to evaluate the programme's benefits. The Office is right to recommend that the Court Service seeks to better understand how efficiently reform services are working. Consistent and timely data collection for this purpose would help ensure this, she said. Now, this report paints a sorry picture concerning the state of our courts and suggests that government has simply not got a grip on these issues. This is not an unfamiliar story elsewhere. Now, have you been affected by the condition of our court buildings or by court facilities? Let us know via our LLG forum.
Well, it's not just court buildings in a failing state, Dennis, but more on that later. In the meantime, the Marriage and Civil Partnership Minimum Age Act 2022 came into effect on Monday, the 27th of February. The Act raises the age of marriage and civil partnership to 18 in England and Wales, with the express intention of Parliament to protect children from the scourge of forced marriage. This means that 16 to 17-year-olds will no longer be able to marry or enter a civil partnership under any circumstances, including with parental or judicial consent from the 26th of February. It will not be possible for anyone under 18 to marry or enter a civil partnership after this date. Currently, forced marriage is only an offence if the person uses a type of coercion, for example, threats, to cause someone to marry, or if the person lacks capacity to consent to marry under the Mental Capacity Act. The Act will therefore also expand the criminal offence of forced marriage in England and Wales to make it an offence in all circumstances to do anything intended to cause a child to marry before they turn 18. It will therefore now be an offence to cause a child under the age of 18 to enter a marriage in any circumstances without the need to prove that a form of coercion was used. The forced marriage offence will continue to include ceremonies of marriage which are not legally binding, for example in community or traditional settings. Those found guilty of the offence will face up to 7 years in prison. Reported by the BBC in 2021, the government's forced marriage unit provided support in 118 cases involving victims who were under 18. However, campaigners believe official figures do not reflect the true scale of the problem, as other victims may not have been able to reach out for support. Now, Dennis, swearing in the workplace, whatever next?
Well, an employment tribunal judge stated that using the F word at work had essentially lost the shock value that it had previously had due to its commonplace usage in society today. Now, whether you agree or not with the judge's view on this, it does raise an interesting question about how you manage different sensitivities within your council. Ms. Hasmita Dadanya was employed as a service account manager. She attended a meeting with her supervisor during which she claimed that he used the F word. This was denied by both the supervisor and another employee present at the meeting. Ms. Dadanya then resigned and brought claims for constructive unfair dismissal, discrimination, harassment, and victimization. The Employment Tribunal unanimously found that Ms. Dadanya had been unfairly dismissed, but had not been subject to discrimination, harassment, or victimization. And an interesting part of the judgment was that the tribunal said that the use of the F word is now commonplace in a work setting and does not carry the shock value that it once did. The tribunal found that the reason that the respondent found it difficult to recall the F word was because of its lack of significance at the time. And importantly, the tribunal accepted that the comment was not intended to be offensive towards Ms. Dadanya. Now, whilst these remarks about expletives are evidence that the tribunal is attempting to reflect what it believes that modern workplaces can be like, it is important that this judgment is not taken as a general endorsement of this kind of behaviour, and that employees should have standards that are communicated to all employees relating to acceptable behaviours and conduct. In the particular circumstances of this case, Ms. Dadanya heard what she considered to be foul language in an aggressive context targeted at her, whereas the tribunal disagreed and found that it was said generally and not directed at her. There would have been a different outcome if the explicit language had been directed towards the claimant, and it is important to note that expletives may still be considered out of place in certain work environments. And moreover, it is also still likely that wording used in a hurtful context will be considered unacceptable and may well amount to discrimination and harassment. Finally, the central question for organisations is this: what if expletives are commonplace in one part of the organisation, but not in others? How can this be reconciled from a legal perspective? And how can standards be set for the whole organisation?
Now, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission have published the findings from their inquiry into the experiences of social care users and carers who have challenged decisions made by local authorities. Originally launched in July 2021, their inquiry examined the experiences of social care users and carers who have challenged decisions made by local authorities. It examined the procedures in place among local authorities across England and Wales and gathered insight from social care professionals. In its new report, the Commission make recommendations to local authorities in England and Wales, the UK and Welsh governments, and a number of other bodies with a role in the care system. The Commission's recommendations include the following: that the UK government make the local government and social care ombudsman the statutory complaint standards authority for adult social care in England, and that the Ombudsman receive new powers to initiate investigations into areas of concern without the need for individual complaints, and that the Welsh Government work with local authorities and others to improve the collection and analysis of equality data from social care users, including those who challenge decisions. This data should be used to identify and address poor outcomes where they are experienced by people who share particular protected characteristics. Now, Dennis, I noticed Max Scala being quoted in the MJ in relation to the Golden Triangle, a relationship of importance and one of LLG's most long-standing and high-profile campaigns. What can you tell us?
Well, yes, indeed. And I turn next to the recent findings of an LGA peer review report whose key findings relate to how the golden triangle of statutory officers should carry out their functions. Here's more on this. The Local Government Association report has recommended that Stockport Council's golden triangle of statutory officers, the Chief Executive, Section 151 officer and monitoring officer, meet once a month to share information and issues in real time. The recommendation came as part of an LGA corporate peer challenge, a voluntary programme involving a team of experienced councillors and council officers spending time to share learning and later produce a report and recommendations based upon their observations. Stockport hosted the team of peers for 4 days in November of last year. The team's report, which was published last week, made 11 key recommendations, including the suggestion that the council host a monthly Golden Triangle meeting. And on the Golden Triangle point, the LGA's peer team noted there are good relationships already across the organisation and a good understanding of the respective roles of officers and members. However, the peer team believe that the council would benefit from further close working between the statutory officers of the organisation to manage live issues and risk. The report added, with this in mind, the team would recommend that in order to build upon the positive working relationships, a monthly meeting of statutory officers is implemented to support the Golden Triangle in sharing information and issues in real time. Well, these findings resonate very closely with how LLG considers that all councils should operate with the closest working relationships among the statutory officers. Now, monitoring officers and governance specialists will want to look closely at many of the findings in the published report.
And finally, from me, the government has been accused of a complete dereliction of duty over the state of school buildings in England after a woman sustained a serious head injury when a large piece of cladding fell off while she was waiting to pick up her children. The incident at a primary school in Sheffield, which was raised in the House of Commons last Monday, came at a time of growing concern about the deteriorating condition of the school estate and warnings that some buildings are in danger of collapse. Now, a few weeks ago in mid-February, The Guardian reported that 7 unions had written to the government demanding immediate action to address the shocking state of school buildings in England, and that the Royal Institute of British Architects had called for full disclosure over exactly which school buildings are most at risk and for urgent intervention to shore up those buildings most likely to structurally fail. If we go back to June 2020, the government announced what the Education Secretary described in the House as a 10-year multi-wave rebuilding programme for schools to replace poor condition and ageing school buildings with modern, energy-efficient designs. The Department for Education's annual financial report for 2021-22, which was published in December 22, identified the condition of school buildings, particularly those built between 1945 and 1970, as one of 6 significant risks the department was managing. The government confirmed last month that at least 39 state schools in England had been forced to close either partially or entirely in the past 3 years because one or more buildings had been deemed unsafe, and that the government had raised the risk level on this issue from critical to critical very likely. And on that rather concerning note, that's it for another edition of the podcast. You can read more on the items discussed today and many more besides by going to bulletin number 8, available on the LLG website now. So it's goodbye from me.
And the same from me too.
Thank you.